the next 30 minutes, we will have the privilege to talk to, I would say, one of the most inspiring voices and thought leaders regarding the future of capitalism. John Fullerton is founder and president of Capital Institute, think, and I would say do tank as well, to explore the transition to a more just, regenerative, and thus sustainable way to live on Earth, and not just to live on Earth, but through a transformation of our finance system. John is entrepreneur, impact investor, and previously he was what you can call a Wall Street banker, a very successful Wall Street banker. He was managing director at JP Morgan, where he worked managing capital markets, derivatives, and private investments around the globe. Dear John, it's a huge privilege for us to have you here with us in Chile. Thank you for this interview.
Wonderful to be with you. I wish it was in person in Chile, but maybe in the near future. But yes. Thank you for the opportunity.
When you resigned from JP Morgan after a nearly 20-year career, you searched like purpose beyond what is defined as a success in Wall Street. And from this time on, like 20 years right now, you are working in a very inspiring way on a way to rethink capitalism with a very systemic and holistic point of view. Should capitalism look like in, let's say, 2050? Regarding this idea of you of regenerative capitalism?
The first thing I would say is I've learned not to get in the predictions business. So I don't know the answer to your question, but I have a framework and some premises and assumptions that I make as I continue to wrestle with the challenges that we're facing. What's now been, I think, very accurately called the polycrisis. This idea that we have, cascading social, political, economic, financial, and of course, ecological crises, multiple crises, all happening at the same time and sort of playing off each other and exacerbating each other. And I think the first thing I would say is that I've come to believe that, none of us, and certainly myself included, are clever enough to figure out how to quote, solve this problem, and that it's not really a problem to solve. And that gets to really the answer to your question. The premise of regenerative economics is that the human economy is actually a living system. It's embedded in a larger living system that we happen to call planet Earth, Gaia, and it's made up of humans and their technologies and their financial system, and humans, of course, are living systems. So if the core premise of regenerative economics is that if it is going to be sustainable, much less thriving and generating prosperity into the future, we will need to learn how to manage it in such a way that it behaves like other living systems. And that's a sort of a simple idea, I think, to propose. We could debate whether the human economy is a living system, but if one accepts that it's a living system, then we actually know a lot from science about how living systems work. And so my work is dedicated to the idea of learning from living systems and seeing how we would need to, in some cases, modify with some policies, and in some cases, radically rethink how we understand our economy.
Very interesting, John, because living systems normally are complex systems, and markets are also complex systems. And this is also the basis for artificial intelligence, system thinking, but we humans do not apply this to our human systems. So there's really a very interesting way to think in future. You also stressed in several documents and interviews this idea of self-organizations of living systems, and this question: how can we get more self-organization also in markets?
Let me try to make just a couple of points, and the first is really to underscore where you started, which is that living systems are complex. The financial system, the economy, certainly complex. What's unique about living systems is that, yes, they're complex, but they also are living. In other words, you can have a complex system that crashes, that collapses. It was complex, but it collapsed. And our goal, obviously, is to create a complex system that doesn't collapse. And so the difference between complexity science and living system science is fundamental. And there is actually an interest from the complexity science community to study and analyze both the economy and financial markets. But, in fact, there are many speculators, hedge funds, that use complexity science to successfully speculate in financial markets. But financial markets have periodic crashes, and we don't want that to happen in a serious way for our global economy. So we need to actually design these systems in a way so they don't collapse. And that's the key. And that's where, to me, the first step is getting clear on, in a sense, the first principles, the design principles, the qualities of living systems that define all living systems across all scales, which the science now, you can study this for years and years, and you'll come to the conclusion that there are patterns and principles that repeat across scales. Things like the importance of relationships, symbiotic win-win relationships. And so that's a clue. If living systems work through collaboration and win-win relationships, but we've got a highly competitive economic system and financial systems, and financial speculation is by definition a win-lose exchange. It's not a win-win collaboration. Well, that tells me that maybe we shouldn't have as much speculation in the economy. Well, there's lots of people that agree with that, but they don't have a theoretical foundation to make that point, and they get trapped in this argument of free markets and government. Free markets are great, and government regulation is a problem, but that has no relevance to how living systems work. And so if we shift the way we look at the financial markets as a living system, it would change the way we think about regulation. Now, the second part of your question, and maybe that was a segue. I guess I partly touched on it, but I'd make a more important point than getting into specific tactics like policies and taxes and governance, regulatory responses. I actually think that we need to step back further and remember that the design of our current global economy really is rooted in the post-World War II era, the so-called Bretton Woods Agreement, where essentially the leaders of the Western world, and again, limited to the Western world, meaning the northern Western world that won the war, decided they wanted to set up a system to ensure that we didn't enter into, we didn't have another world war. That was the driving force, and that we needed a massive economic stimulus to recover from the cost of the war. So that was the context that the Bretton Woods system, the World Bank, the IMF, the G20, all that stuff kind of is rooted in the post-war reconstruction, reconfiguration. Well, the context today is totally different from then. First and foremost, we are wrestling with a, life-threatening ecological crisis beyond anyone's imagination in those days. And we are bumping into thresholds, limits, climate change being one symptom of that, but there are multiple symptoms. So the context today, to me, suggests we need to rethink the design of the whole system and the institutions of the system. And, the biggest missing piece is an institution of the commons to protect the natural commons. And then there are other missing pieces to deal with the let's call it the inequality crisis and the insecurity crisis. And those are two distinct things. I think most people I think the inequality crisis is front of mind. There's been a lot of focus on it. The statistics are terrifying, but even more terrifying or equally terrifying to me is the insecurity crisis. And that probably, if you asked people in rich countries and poor countries, how many people really feel secure, just from an economic perspective, not, forget about, political or violence, but just from an economic perspective, how many people feel secure? It's certainly a small minority. So here we've got a system where a small minority of the people feel basic security, much less thriving and opportunity and possibility. So I think before we get into policies, we really need to think at a very fundamental level about the context that we're dealing with. And then the final challenge is that we need to do that while the world is on fire, literally. And so there's this, overwhelming, we need to rush to solutions, but we don't have the right structure of institutions to deal with the context that we're dealing with. And certainly the institutions that were developed in a different context are by definition going to be very slow to change and adapt, because institutions become institutions because they're good at staying as they are, not because they bend to the latest loudest voice on a particular moment in time. So, it's an overwhelming challenge. And maybe I'll just finish this by saying that the good news, there's a lot of bad news, but the good news is that one thing we've learned about systems is that they change in response to pressure. So what seemed impossible 5 years ago, much less 25 years ago, is actually starting to seem not only possible, but inevitable in response to the pressure. So the worse it gets, the more likely it is that we will shift. And I'd like to see that the transformation to regenerative economic thinking is one of those inevitable responses to the crises that we're wrestling with.
The interesting or the challenge really is also our brain and what neuroscience says about functioning of our brains, because brains are not really well designed and well equipped to think in the long run and think with more complexity, because our brains are quite automatical and quite linear in their thinking, as Daniel Kahneman, for example, shows, and many others. And in that way, your invitation is to think on living systems, but also combined with complexity we are not used to. And how could institutions look like in future that could prevent really and could be more the institutions to think strategically?
Neuroscience and how brains work. And it sounds like you've probably read more than I have on the subject. But I have developed a pretty strong point of view about one aspect of our brains that we've reinforced at the expense of another aspect. And of course, our brains are also complex, enormously complex. So it's hard to generalize. But for eons, people have generalized in understanding our minds by referring to, in again, very general terms, the masculine and the feminine energy, and masculine and feminine ways of knowing and ways of thinking. And we simplify this into, masculine is analytical and feminine is creative and more conceptual or more intuitive. And ever since the scientific revolution, we have given high marks to the analytical and low marks to the intuitive. And we've promoted one over the other, and we've given rewards for one over the other. We give compensation in the workplace to one over the other, and we've demeaned one in the face of the other. Well, it turns out that, if you go back a little bit earlier than the scientific revolution, there were all kinds of wisdom traditions that relied more on the intuitive side, or at least held them in balance. But if there was a master and a servant, the master was the intuition and the servant was the number cruncher. And therefore, the indigenous wisdom traditions, for example, thought in long-term seventh generation time frame. So I'm not, and frankly, modern neuroscience is a brilliant example of the analytical mind analyzing the brain, I suspect, much more than the intuitive mind analyzing the brain. So I actually don't buy the fact that we are broken beings that can only think in the short term, because we've developed out of a form of knowing that is much more long-term oriented and much more aligned with how living systems work. The oak tree in a forest doesn't operate in a quarterly basis. It operates in a hundreds of year basis. So I think it's about relearning and rethinking how we use our brains as much as it is any limitations of our brains.
Is it for you more learning and sharing and more education, or is it more giving other rules to financial markets where speculation brings you to excessive short-term acts and short-term thinking, in fact? So is there space for education, how financial markets are functioning, or do they need other rules as this excess capital requirements that might bring you a little bit away from the winner takes it all and too big logic?
So it's certainly both. I've dedicated my life work now to what we would call education as opposed to policy and activism, because I've learned, and people way smarter than me figured this out a long time ago. In particular, Dana Meadows, she has she's a system science at MIT. She was lead author of Limits to Growth, and she wrote a very important paper called Places to Intervene in a System. And she makes the point that if you want to change a system, the most important or the most powerful leverage point is the paradigm within which the system exists. So here's an example. I made the point I made earlier about speculation. The natural policy response to that doesn't solve it, but it certainly goes a long way, and it's complicated. So some speculation is actually useful for liquidity in markets, but it's the excess that is the problem. And the excess is orders of magnitude more, in my opinion, than the productive part. So a natural policy response is what we call the financial transaction tax. This is not a new idea. It goes way back. Tobin called it, the Tobin tax many years ago. Throw some sand in the works. But I went to DC and I argued with many politicians that we needed a financial transaction tax after the financial crisis. And I got, no audience from the conservatives, and the audience from the Democrats, the more liberal side, had no idea what I was talking about, because their brains were locked in this notion that capital markets need to be efficient because efficiency is good for growth, and growth is a source of our prosperity. And if you put taxes on financial transactions, you'll harm efficiency of markets, and that's like the cardinal sin. So before we can even have a sophisticated conversation about policy, we need to shift the paradigm. And so it's education, but it's actually not so much traditional education. It's almost like an awakening to a new way of seeing what everyone already sees, just seeing it in a new way. And you get this aha. And then once you see it, you can't unsee it. So that's my focus, is to help people have that aha, because then what follows becomes obvious. Just like, imagine this is an analogy I've been using recently. Imagine not realizing that they're damaging themselves, and they need to be, quote, taught to stop chewing on their arm because they're going to want their arm. I mean, that's literally what we're doing. We're chewing on our arm because we're all connected to, the ecological crisis and the inequality crisis and the insecurity crisis. It affects all of us.
John, the one concern worldwide, in fact, is the concentration in markets. You saw it quite well in capital markets and growing market power in several industries. So how is this combinable with the idea of a more symbiotic, regenerative capitalism? Because there are really issues you can't fix with just another point of view, but more with rules. And there I would come back more to ordoliberal pro-competition policies that might be necessary to rethink in this century as well. So how do you see this?
Well, for sure. And I mean, the imbalance of power. So one of the principles I talk about is balance. It's like a dynamic balance. And certainly there is a massive, massive imbalance of power between, large enterprises and the rest of the economic system. Certainly true in finance, but obviously true outside of finance as well. I can only speak in the United States, but I suspect it's as equally true in Chile. The ideology is that, it's a free market and survival of the fittest. Well, that's just incompatible with the true understanding of how ecology works. And so absolutely, there needs to be a much more aggressive legal description of excess power, and then a much more courageous enforcement mechanism that, many, many big, powerful companies will not like at all. And if we're serious about making the economy behave like a living system, the analogy I like to use is the lions spend most of the day sleeping, because if they spent all day eating, they know they'd eat all their food and they would die of starvation. But we actually subsidize the lions to eat more and get bigger and fatter. And we should be doing the opposite. So the policy response should be massive support and subsidy for new enterprises, innovation, diversity of enterprises, diversity of forms, diversity of business models, and massive constraint on the most powerful in order to keep the system in balance. But we need a different metaphor than survival of the fittest to convince policymakers that that's in our interest. And of course, the companies in our country have the policymakers in their back pocket through corrupt political systems. So it's a huge, huge challenge. One of the things we talk about in the regenerative space is the power of removing obstacles. So that the living systems naturally create, they naturally manifest potential that exists if you just remove the obstacles that allow them to do that. So, if you're, again, using as an analogy the human body, if you just stop eating junk food, you'll do all kinds of things that you don't even intend to. You don't have to figure it all out. Just stop eating the junk food. Well, we need to pull the junk food out of the economy, by analogy, and lots of good things will happen. We don't actually have to solve all these problems in advance if we follow how living systems work.
In that same sense, when you look at environmental, social, and corporate governance issues, ESG, then you also wrote about that. You can see that, in fact, we have like 20 years talking about ESG, but markets are not really sustainable. And we created this huge concept with the illusion to go forward. But in fact, now we are asking ourselves, is this really what we should do, or is there another method? And we see like huge investors as BlackRock being between one side, the society asking for sustainable investments, and on the other side, you see the pressure to make the most profitable investments. And you see that in too many cases, when there are trillions of dollars, for example, in fossil fuels, it's not because of banks or investors are bad institutions with bad leaderships, but it's a good investment. So as markets have as their language money, how could we get it that sustainability gives you more money as enterprise? Because if not, you will never get an actor like BlackRock or other investors really be true sustainable, because they can't. They always will be in this gray area of green and ESG washing finally.
The ESG conversation. That's we're going to need another half hour at least for that. So what shall I say? I first would just point out that the good intentions of the ESG movement were again a product of our, in my opinion, flawed ideology. They were based on the premise that markets will solve this. We just need better markets. In order to have better markets, we need more transparency, we need more data, and then markets will solve the problem. I mean, there's nothing more naive that I could think of than to suggest that markets can solve climate change. So, but we've been working on that premise for 25 years. So the first thing is to drop that premise and recognize we're dealing with a problem that markets are not well suited to deal with. Markets are a tool. A fork is a tool, and it's really, really good for eating steak and really bad for eating soup or broth, to make my analogy. And we're trying to use our super tool for everything, and it's not working. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is there's all kinds of noise and probably again lots of good intention, but bad thinking, bad analysis that goes into the whole ESG paradigm. My colleagues at R 3.0, I think, say it perfectly. It's a outside in framework. What are the risks to my company and my shareholders? It's not an inside out framework. What is the risk my company poses to humanity and life on this planet? And then third, and most importantly, there's no even discussion about thresholds. Like, we can only do so much of something, and we're doing 5x of it today. So we need it. What the tool we need is really what we call a quota, but we're not allowed to say that in capitalist terminology. But we need a tool like a quota, and then we need to have the hard conversation about how to allocate the quota. So is an African family's desire to have electric lights so they can read at night more important than Jeff Bezos' desire to have a 500-foot yacht to sail around the Mediterranean when he feels like it? Those are choices we have to make, and we're not even having the conversation that those are choices. We're having conversations that we can always do whatever we want. We're just going to need to do it differently. But getting back to, I think I lost the train of the last part of your question. I got myself carried away. The markets connection again?
How to put more profitable incentives to sustainable actors, because we cannot think that B Corps, enterprises with purpose to create value for society, that are really important, but we can't think that goodwill and these kind of enterprises must exist to solve problems of capitalism. But the rules in itself of capitalism should be like in the way that your enterprise, when you're sustainable, will be more profitable.
I can't cite them off the top of my head, but there have been studies, and common sense tells us that if we properly, this is this question of what if we priced the externalities and internalized them into a company's profit and loss statement. There are plenty of studies that conclude what intuitively we should know is true, that virtually every company on planet Earth would be unprofitable if it properly costed out and internalized externalities, no matter what reasonable price you put on social and environmental costs, beginning with carbon. Well, I can tell a little anecdote, but that I believe is true, worthy of analysis. People want to do the analysis. What is certainly true is that companies would be massively less profitable and many would be unprofitable. So that's the baseline. The baseline is not the current earnings of the world, index of stocks of public companies that have a PE multiple of 20 or 15 because they're expected to grow from that base. The baseline is way, 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 way below where we're operating. And I'm not smart enough to know how you can keep the earnings growth going from a faulty fake baseline forever and ever and deal honestly with the challenges we're facing. That is a fundamental truth, reality that we are uncomfortable talking about. But if we're serious, we need to talk about it. Now, that doesn't mean every single company is going to be worse off. I've made investments in companies that are growing and should grow and grow their earnings because they're responding to the crisis that we face with real practical solutions.
Wouldn't it be necessary as well to think about more policies to help enterprises as well? You made some calculations about stranded assets, for example, and cited Al Gore also with like $25 trillion of stranded assets. In fact, we must face, and we must face this truth that net zero has its cost, and we must think how to share the cost of net zero as well. Just to mention one dimension of ESG. And so to get sustainable is also to think about how to help enterprises, because, as you said, it can't be that enterprises should bear everything alone when it gets to sustainability. So this is a conversation that should be much better to begin and to get deeper about how governments with public policies should help enterprises in their way. For example, regarding the stranded assets and depreciations, we must organize in future.
The challenge is that governments as a group already feel strapped from a budgetary point of view. We first dumped a load of debt on them to bail out the Wall Street banking system in response to the financial crisis. Probably historians will view that as the greatest moral injustice ever invoked on humanity, or one of the greatest. Maybe not the greatest, I shouldn't say the greatest, but certainly a massive injustice that has left us much worse off, much worse equipped to deal with this poly crisis. And then we had the pandemic, which just exacerbated it. But what we learned through those experiences is that central banks, and in particular the US Federal Reserve, and a very small number of other, leading economy central banks, have enormous capacity to finance, rescue of various sorts, without the world coming to an end the way the doomsters said it would. Yes, we got some inflation, but it's not, post-World War I Germany inflation, and for good reason. And so, and again, I'm now living in, what's today fantasy land, but I believe will become inevitable. We have to marshal the collective financing capacity of, call it the 3 to 5 leading central banks, who can absolutely target trillions of dollars that can be leveraged by the private sector, even into multiple probably tens of trillions, into the transition we absolutely need to have for all of our sakes. And now that will require a change in laws in most countries, if not all, because central banks have very clear mandates. And so it has to be done by the private sector. And yet, as you point out, the private sector is really good at causing money to flow downhill, but not very good at causing money to flow uphill. And there's a bunch of things that need to happen, like we need to, do solar across Africa. And if money isn't going to naturally flow there, it's naive to think that, the private sector on their own, and particularly the small, fragile startups that are run by passionate entrepreneurs are going to do this on their own. We need a policy response. And if governments don't have the financing capacity because they're already overextended because of bailing out from the pandemic and bailing out from the financial crisis, then the logical conclusion, in my opinion, is that there is some new institutional response, which is a collaboration of the leading central banks. And then, once we understand we actually have the capacity to finance this, then the hard part is, okay, how do we channel it in a constructive way that meets the needs of recipient countries, and what are the terms, and how does it get distributed, and making sure it's not just another colonial project, which it would inevitably be if it's not done in a constructive way.
John, I would have like 100 more questions, but just a last one. It's very interesting to hear you and to learn from your vision. You're talking about system change, and you're talking also not only about environmental challenges, but also social challenges, wealth concentration, power concentration, and this idea of symbiosis, and how to get the economic system and the finance system to support really a way to collaborate more, and not only to go on administrating a system that is extractive and not really value creating, and that is not sustainable in future. Do you see, after 10 years after founding Capital Institute, which for me is very inspiring as an initiative, do you think that markets, investors see you more and more like a refreshing innovator and thought leader, or more like a rebel that distracts?
I think, what's that old, saying, first they ignore you, then they get mad at you, and then you win, or something like that. So, I mean, I definitely have felt like I've been ignored primarily more than anything since I've been on this journey. I mean, my friends even, I think, prior to the financial crash, I was asking all these questions, and they pretty much, I think, assumed I'd lost my mind or become some tree hugger type. And then the crash happened, and then all of a sudden they started paying more attention. And I find increasingly people are interested in what I'm doing. In fact, it's sort of ironic. I'm about to attend I don't know what number it is, but the reunion, first time ever, of my training program from Morgan that I was in back in the early 1980s. And I'm surprised how many of my former colleagues actually know what I'm doing and are genuinely interested in it. And so I think it's like all of these, they say, how do you go bankrupt, slowly and then quickly? I think my work is an example of, I'm supposed to spend my lifetime in the wilderness, and then suddenly, hopefully, it'll have meaning and impact. And honestly, I do feel that shift happening just in the last year. It's almost like the pandemic might have triggered it in some way that I don't fully understand. But it is different now than it was, even 3 years ago. And so I'm quite hopeful. I mean, there's a book that just came out that's taking down the tech billionaires and how extractive and, just trash is. I haven't read it yet. I just heard about it, just out. and then the final chapter is apparently all about my work and the need for a regenerative economy. So it's slowly, very slowly seeping into the quote mainstream. And I think the World Business Council has a huge opportunity and role to play. I'm very fond of the organization. I know the founder or the current president, and he's an example of the leadership that we need. So, but bringing these big companies along is a hard task, and I give everyone working in the organization credit for doing the hard day-to-day grinding work, and by no means want to suggest it's easy. It's easier for me to sit outside here in Connecticut and throw my ideas around than to actually do the hard work inside these organizations.
John, thank you so much for your time, for your inspiring words, for really a huge community. You are an inspiring leader, although I know as well to challenge the system has some kind of punishment always with it as well. And John, congratulations for what you have constructed, the institution, the organization you built, and all the thoughts you are sharing in a very generous way. So thank you from Chile, and we hope to stay in contact with you because your idea of system change and living system and regenerative capitalism is in fact the way how to advance in the vision 2050 for capitalism in the view of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development as well. So I think your words and your analysis and thoughts point in the direction how to get it done. So thank you so much for that, John.
Thank you for this opportunity. It's really a privilege to contribute, and I would just maybe close by saying and I'm not saying this because I'm speaking to a Chilean audience, that there is zero doubt in my mind that countries like Chile and Denmark and South Korea are going to lead this, and not the United States. We are an institution that is most stuck in the old way of thinking and seeing. And when I travel around the world, my hope and inspiration much more comes from countries and cultures that are still more connected to their roots and are just less, prone to being, absorbed in their own quote unquote greatness, that makes it much harder to change. So I'm cheering for you to lead the way.
Thank you, John.